Welcome to UberCube, the place where we talk about Cube, but with refreshments. I'm your host, May, and I am joined by my lovely co-host.
Hey, it's Stu, and we're doing another double act today as May is back from... You was at a convention? Is that correct?
Yeah, I was at a convention. Stu, what are you having to drink?
Well, you know what? I felt today is Friday, so this is our usual day of recording, but it's been a bit of a long week.
TGIF.
So I'm having a cup of tea. What about yourself?
I'm going to join you in that cup of tea.
Very nice. Excellent. Good choice.
So the tea that I'm having is Maui Mango, which is a blend of pineapple, orange slices, mango, safflowers, hibiscus, strawberries, and marigold.
Ooh, anyone that knows me will tell you that I have a drawer full of fruity teas in my kitchen. It's like an essential part of my routine. When I go to bed, I've usually got some kind of fruity tea that I'm taking up with me. But today, I've just got a cup of just orange pico, bit of sweetener, bit of moo juice. Love it.
Very tasty.
Yes. So... Today, May, you have decided that you want to approach another sort of more meta conversation. So this is kind of followed on. The last couple of episodes have been not about a specific cube or card. We're generally talking about some more philosophical, theoretical cube stuff.
Yeah. So the topic that I feel like that I wanted to talk about today was related to accessibility and kind of the skill floor when it comes to playing cube.
Okay.
Like, I have a sort of obstacle with a lot of my cube group. Well, a lot of my magic group, per se, because most of the time we play Commander, right? And convincing them to play cube is actively difficult. So when they do actually want to play cube, and we ended up having a session a couple weeks ago where they were actually excited and wanting to schedule it outside of me, so that way I can just bring the fake cube, show up, and they wanted to play the cube, and it was good. It was a fun time. But we ended up leading into some conversations because when it comes to some of my other cube designs, like Big Spender or the Shadow Game cube or whatnot, I can tend to be a little bit more creative, a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? Not rambunctious as much as I tend to look at cube building as a fun deck building challenge, and building kind of mini games around that is a lot of fun. So like Big Spender, we have our like change that we trade in order to buy cards, and then Shadow Game is, relatively speaking, tame. It is just magic, but I have Sharpie to like Morph Fest on a bunch of cards, right? And it is interesting because one of the things that was noted was that my play group feels like that is not magic.
So,
which is definitely an opinion.
It is. And I feel that, especially with groups that are particularly enfranchised in Commander, the level of enfranchisement that they will have in Magic extends beyond just the decks that they are playing, that they're shuffling up, that they're building. It's more about just the vibe and how the evening is going to go, right? So you're expecting, and I will say that our group was somewhat guilty of this, if I would, for want of a better word, is that, and we've talked about this numerous times before on the podcast, we would show up in our group and we would show up to play Commander. And I would be the one to get up, I would get my bag of Magic, all my Commander decks would come with me. There was never a consideration that we would do anything other than play Commander. And I can imagine, I myself have always been a little more adventurous and have explored other formats and other ways to play Magic, but I could certainly echo what you said, that I have people that I play with occasionally, and most certainly that if I just showed up one day to one of our Commander games, which isn't very often, but we have another friend outside of one of our usual evenings, and if I said, hey, I've brought this cube, do you want to play? Instead of playing Commander, I would be met with, no. Why would we want to play cube? And especially, not just why would we want to spend the time drafting and playing decks that we're not familiar with, but why would we want to not play our Commander decks? I'm emotionally, financially, and whatever else invested into this deck, right? Or decks that I'm expecting to play on my evening. And you mentioned that you've taken it a step further. And let's be honest, I will play a little devil's advocate in that I kind of understand it from the perspective of Magic has had this sort of in its formula, this grounding in its formula, right? Where you have a deck, you shuffle it up, you play lands, you cast spells, right? Your creativity is extending way beyond that.
Right. And it's not that I think that these types of cubes that are breaking the mold are necessarily a bad thing in terms of what playgroups are looking for. Like, I've actually gotten a lot of praise because of how Big Spender plays, because it doesn't play like real Magic, obviously, but it kind of plays like its own more different card game, right? It plays like more of like a board game to a degree, right?
I would agree. Well, I played it. It was fun.
Right. And there is this weird area in between that Shadow Game is currently sitting in, right? Where when people are wanting to cube, they just want to go to the Fey Cube because a lot of the cards are familiar. They want to go to the Fey Cube because it's pretty easy to understand, it's accessible, it's tested. They can go on to Cube Cobra, they can look at the data, they can look at the sheet, they can know what's going on, right? Versus when it comes to Big Spender, right? It's already so far gone, lost in the weeds and whatnot, that it's like, sure, it's not Magic, but the thing that it's doing is interesting and engaging because of how far it is removed. So it can be like a fun like mini game, even though it uses like Magic cards, right? And then Shadow Games is somewhere in this uncomfortable middle point where even though fundamentally Shadow Game plays like Magic, right? I'm not changing a majority of the other rules. I'm not doing anything else. The main differences, two big differences, are first is we have some cards that are Sharpied. Cards that are Sharpied to have Manifest Morph, like I mentioned before. And the second difference is that you don't keep track of like what's actually morphed and manifest. You don't keep track of them in the piles. That's not the point of the game. The whole point of it is that it's supposed to be like this. I'm playing my creatures face down and trying to like shuffle them and do like this shell game type thing, right? But everything else about it is still Magic, right?
So explain Shadow Games to me. Like keep it simple. Give me a high level view of what Shadow Games is.
Sure. So it is a bar cube. So there's no counters, no tokens. And the centralizing theming around a lot of the cards is that you have a bunch of these French vanilla creatures or creatures with kind of simplistic effects that have morph or manifest, right? So, for example, I have a card that is, I think it was Fenrotting Snake, I think it was called, where it's like a 5/1.
Okay.
And you can manifest it. I think I put it for 2 black or 1 black, something like that.
Okay.
Right? Since it's going to be relevant. And I took the time to actually like Sharpie the card like in picture editor and like put it like onto Cube Cobra so that we can see like what I'm actually doing with it. I also like marked all the cards. Oh, sorry. It's morph and flip for a black.
Okay.
Right. So it's like an absurdly good rate. You're never going to be playing this like outright just for 4.
Sure.
Right. Like, unless you really want that, like, 1 extra toughness. But a majority of the time, you're trying to, like, play it first down for the 3 colorless.
Right.
As a 2/2, because the morph mechanic. And then you're going to turn it face up for the black. Right? It's pushing kind of the extent of, like, this vanilla 5/1 card that doesn't do a whole lot else into this new territory of, I'm now going to try to find ways to manifest this on the board and then flip it over for cheap after I've already, like, swung. Right?
So, how complicated is that to keep track? You say you don't keep track of what's morphed, or just maybe I'm not understanding us correctly, but because I think about it this way, I'm always thinking of what happens when the board starts to get a little full, right? So now you might have multiple morphed or manifested creatures. Like, do you find that players are spending a lot of time like flipping their cards over and keeping track of which creature is which and so on and so forth? Like, has that ever been like a distraction or a negative during the play experience?
So from the feedback that I've gotten, that really hasn't been a factor just because of how removal dense the format is.
Okay.
Because there's a lot of times where a lot of the removal is encouraging you to have to kind of flip over early, or a lot of it's like timing based where it's just like, I can flip this over now in order to dodge the removal, but then I won't be able to get through. Or more importantly, I'm just trying to trick you into swinging at me and then use this as like a blocker, for example.
Okay,
like I have
enough.
like a spider that has like reach death touch, right?
Yeah. Okay, interesting. So let me go back to the original point, right? So this is about skill floor. So we're going to avoid where possible skill ceiling discussion, possibly, and stick with the skill floor. So a skill floor obviously is what it says. It's the lowest amount of skill required. And I'll just leave it at that. I'm not going to start talking about context yet. So now I'm going to ask you for that context. Skill floor, but where exactly are you thinking about this skill floor when it comes to playing a cube? Is it just cube in general? Is it more magic oriented? Are you thinking of it more with these more creative, if you will, designs that you're talking about specifically with the environments that you're bringing? Like where is that skill floor discussion kind of focusing on?
So the thing that I've kind of had to confront from the conversation I had with my group was that my perspective is warped because I'm deep in the weeds in Magic. Right? So even though I would consider like a skill floor being like, hey, I only have 2 centralized mechanics. We have Morph, we have Manifest, and then the rest is kind of like vanilla creatures, right? It's like vanilla creatures, French vanilla creatures. They're not complex cards. The complexity comes from like how you actually use them, right? But I feel like that there's a sort of intimidation factor to it, because not only are people like scared to like learn new cards, they're scared to try drafting and like building from what they can see and whatnot, because they don't trust their skills in like determining a card's strength or value or whatnot in a pack, right? And I feel like that's where a lot of that kind of skill floor is tested from somebody who plays a lot of limited versus somebody who doesn't. Somebody who plays a lot of limited, this is just like another thing to assess on these cards, right? Like if you were to look at, again, the Rotting Fen Snake, if it didn't have Morph, it would not be a very good card, right? It is actively just a fragile, 3-costed, 5/1 snake, right? But as soon as you add Morph to it, then all of a sudden your assessment becomes, okay, how easy is it for me to manifest this? How easy is it for me to turn it up? So on and so forth. And that comes from experience. And that's kind of the part where I need to step back as a limited player and kind of reassess, like, what's the difficulty amongst approaching it rather than just like individual things. Because it's difficult for me to kind of grasp, because I'm so far in the weeds, that people have a hard time assessing not only cards that they don't know, but cards that now have specialty text on them. No matter how much I consider it simplistic, it's now specialty text.
I can see it. And I will say, I can see it from both perspectives, right? So I can see it from yours. If these were very, very complex creatures with all, you're talking about vanilla, French vanilla, right? So that could be, again, a vanilla creature, which is what it is, or something with a very straightforward, simplistic ability. If you then took that and kind of ran with it and really sort of amplified the complexity of the cube, I can certainly imagine from a non-limited, non-enfranchised player that probably would be a little intimidating. And I always kind of frame it like I value my time, like people should. And especially with cube, and maybe this is more of a cube thing than it is other formats, because you're not just asking people, sit down here, play this deck, and if you don't like the game, right, could just be one game that takes a few minutes, then okay, fine, we'll shuffle up and we'll do something else, right? Sure, okay, fine, we'll play a game of Commander. But with cube, you've now got the draft as well as a game, and when you're drafting, you've now got sort of this expectation that you're not just going to pick up and walk away with your cards, because there are other people that are kind of reliant on you sticking around and playing your deck, because you kind of need multiple players in a cube environment, right? Otherwise, someone's just sitting there twiddling their thumbs while maybe another couple of people are playing. So I can understand it from that. But, and it's interesting you made the point about, yes, you are a very enfranchised Magic player, cube curator, inventor. You're not just creating cubes, you're creating formats and games and all this kind of stuff. You're probably, well, not even probably, you're definitely more deep into the weeds than someone like myself is. But because I have a interest in sort of exploring how Magic can be used outside of just those traditional 60 and 100 card decks and even limited, then those kind of things will appeal to me. But I guess I couldn't sort of extend that expectation to all players. And it's one of the reasons why, like I say, when I show up, when I've got certain people who are hosting these Commander events or these Commander play nights or afternoons or whatever, I'm just showing up with my Commander decks, and I'm probably not going to ask them to play anything else.
Right. And to be clear, like, as a clarification, this isn't me, like, ragging on my friends, being like, I'm going to come on here and start talking crap about them or whatnot. That's not my point.
No,
my point is that it is making me have to reassess, like, my position, right? It is me trying to not only come to terms with what their positions are, but also understand why they are intimidated by these things. And as much as I joke with, like, my girlfriend and whatnot, where it's just like, I want to play these cubes, they're so cool, but my play group's a bunch of cowards and whatnot. As much as it's the funny joke, I can't bring them to, like, play stupid things, right? They want to have Magic that is familiar, they want to have Magic that is repetitive, and they want to be able to feel like they have this investment, and that's why they tend to like Commander, right? And even when it comes to the Fey Cube, there is a sort of approach that you can repeat with the Fey Cube. And that's kind of been the part where I've had to talk with my sister a few times, because she's not very confident in her abilities with drafting, right? And the way that I explained it in a previous episode was that if you think of Commander kind of like playing Minecraft, right? Where everybody's just kind of going out, doing their adventure, building their house and whatnot. And then when you show people, basically showing off your fiddle toy, showing off your building, showing off your mob grinder or whatnot, right? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what the vibe of Commander is about, right? It's about having our things interact with each other and showing off our fiddle toys, right? Versus when you go to Cube, this is more like Smash Brothers, right? Where you're going back to the same characters every time. And sure, the cards you have access to may be a little different every time, but there are like those archetypes that you can rely on, that you have knowledge in, and you know how to build those decks, and that takes expertise. It takes time to learn those things and identify those things, and it can be difficult for people to identify things like signposts and whatnot without those clear, like, signposty type cards, right? So,
but people really do love their Commander decks. And again, I think with Cube, this familiarity, right? And I think we're at a point now with the Fey Cube, I would probably guess at least that your group is probably so familiar with the Fey Cube. It's been a project of yours for a long time. They've probably played it a few times. So if you show up and you're like, hey, I really, really want to play my Fey Cube today, they're probably going to indulge you, right? It's going to take at least a number of people to be like, no, I really don't want to, or maybe I've built a new Commander deck or whatever. So they want to, they'll be happy to do that, because it's again, that cushy, that nice warm blanket, that they've got that familiarity with it. So, and I would say that you can sort of expand that out to all of the different fundamentals when it comes to the skill floor, right? So you've got the understanding of the draft process, right? And that is not how do you pass a pack of cards around? It's an understanding of the cube itself, the archetypes that might exist, the creatures, as well as just, I think, going back to what you mentioned with your shiny handing pennies around to get cards, is now you also know that when the gameplay is happening, you're playing one land each turn, you're tapping them to cast your creatures and your instants and your sorceries, and there's no hidden sort of different mechanics, right? Everything is just the way that Richard Garfield intended, as well as the card evaluation, right? So they've had a chance to be able to play that cube on numerous occasions. They know what the good cards are, where the bombs are, where the removal and the interaction is going to be focused, and where those cards are. So that's again, it's all part of that familiarity. And again, the tracking of those archetypes. And because, everyone's got different personalities, different likes, different desires when they play Magic. So if someone is familiar, at least, we can talk about the Fey Cube, but it can really extend to any cube. If they sit down and they're like, oh, I like playing control, and I know that this cube has a control element, which I like, or it has an aggro element that I like, then they're getting that, again, a nice warm fuzzy blanket, that they're able to play something that they like. And again, that kind of falls all the way back to Commander, because when you're going to a room and you're going to sit down and play a game of Commander with people, if you've got enough decks where you've got a choice on different archetypes and play styles, then you can just pick out the one deck that you want to play because it fits in either with the kind of player that you are or the mood that you're in. So I think if you're... we've had numerous discussions on our podcast, as I'm sure a lot of Cube fanatics and aficionados have had, with what can be a massive challenge is, let's say you're walking into your local game store and you're trying to get a group of people together to play Cube, especially if, like is the case across a lot of local game stores, and even groups of friends that you might have, to walk in and say, hey, let's play my Cube instead of playing whatever it is that you thought you were originally showing up to. That can be a difficult conversation. And I think this is where understanding this flaw of and being able to present that, and it's going to be different for any group. You could walk into an LGS and it's 4 people playing precons or very, very straightforward decks. Okay, you might think, okay, we'll bring in a fairly simple Cube. You could have people playing CDH. And you think, hey, I've got this very, very complex, wonderfully mechanically difficult cube, but I think it might really appeal to you. Do you want to try it out? And those conversations might be a little bit easier. So I think that flaw, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but this is not just a skill flaw from being able to play Magic. It's a skill flaw of presenting your cube and attempting to sort of sell it, if you will, evangelize for it within a group. Like, there's so many different facets to go from, putting together a cube design to taking it all the way to fruition where you can sit there with a group of people and play it.
Yeah, I feel like that is definitely a big aspect of it. Like, it ended up coming up in a conversation where we were talking about... Essentially, I was interested in building a new cube I was going to call the Super Smash Cube.
Okay.
And the concept of it was just like a lot of those classic modern All-Stars, a lot of those like iconic classic Magic cards. Think Thragtusk, Resto Angel, Snapcaster, whatnot. Like
Siege
a lot
Rhino.
of these generally good cards that have become, let's say, a little outdated, right?
Little power crept, just a little bit.
Little power crept,
a little bit,
right? But they're iconic. They're recognizable. They created their like mold into Magic's identity, and having a cube that represents that, I felt like was a good decision, right? However, there's an uncomfortable reality that comes with it of, even if I do create something that has a lot of those familiar cards and whatnot, getting my players to not just play the Fey cube is already going to be its own obstacle, because they want that familiarity, right? They want that accessibility, and they want the thing that they've already been practicing with, because a lot of my group tends to be a little bit on the spiky side, where they're just like, I want to keep improving and like optimizing my choices and whatnot, so that way every time that I come back to it, I feel like I'm getting a little better, right? Which is why I try not to make huge sweeping changes over a long period of time, because it's like, every time they come back to it, I don't want them to feel like that this is some brand new environment, as much as hey, there's maybe some new tools that help the deck that you were trying to play before that you weren't quite happy with, that you wanted to be better, and now it can be a little better. Things like that, right? But there is a certain degree of having to ask myself as a cube builder of, am I wanting to create an experience because it is something that my players are going to seek out and enjoy? Or is it because I'm looking for this happy juices in my brain to do something weird and experimental and then have other people kind of relish in the absurdity of it, right? And the problem is that I have a group that doesn't jive with weird absurdity, right? And it's not to say that they are wrong for it. It's not to say that I'm right for being the chaotic little gremlin I am. It's to say that part of running a successful like group for playing Magic is being able to assess what your players need and what you're wanting to accomplish. And what's particularly difficult when we're talking about like skill floors in particular is that I have a few players in my group that are relatively new to Magic.
Okay.
Right? So not only are they going to have a hard time assessing cards just in general, but they have this sort of blanket, let's say, fear of approaching Cube, because it's like, there's a bunch of things that we don't recognize, and now there's like some weird thing with Sharpied cards or whatever, and it's just like all of a sudden it gets to be too much for them, right? Versus even with the Fake Cube, I can't get them to come play the Fake Cube. That's just not going to happen until one day they happen to feel comfortable enough to maybe try it. But
so what is the comfort level for those players then? Just so we can be clear, because I think that's an important piece of context within discussion, right? Is if those players are new to Magic, and new to Magic is obviously a relative thing, right? So new could be a day, it could be a week, it could be a few months if it's in comparison to yourself and some of the other people that are in your group, right? So where does their skill level as well as their exposure to Magic kind of fall in with that newness? Like, where would you put that?
Well, considering that it is a recently common thing that new players are coming in to play Commander, that's essentially what these new players have come in to do. And keep in mind, my opinion is that Commander is horrible for learning Magic, right? Like, it is very much of a format that it's like, I'm going to be doing a lot of absurd things and then expecting you to, like, have any sort of idea, like, when you're supposed to interact or what's going on my side of the board. And Cube is not much better, unfortunately. Even if the Cube is really simplistic, right? Even if we're talking very simple cubes that are designed that not to be wordy, for example.
Sure.
And all these cards are like simple, straight to the point, easy Magic. There's still the draft aspect that is scary for new players.
That was the point I was gonna make. It's not just about playing Magic anymore, right? Now you've got this portion where you've got to choose your cards, and you don't get the luxury of sitting around looking at Scryfall or reviewing deck lists, right? You literally might just have a few minutes of, hey, here's an overview on Cube Cobra and maybe a few little talking points about the archetypes. But now you've also got that. Well, not only do I have to try and get an understanding of that in very quickly, but I've also got this challenge that I've got all these other people that are going to be drafting against me, and they're potentially much more experienced and maybe, for want of a better word, better Magic players. And that's got to be pretty daunting for someone, especially when they're new.
So one of the things that kind of separates Cube from, say, sealed or limited or whatnot, like retail drafts, is that there's a sort of equalizing aspect to what everybody has access to in a retail draft, because you basically have the rare card. Hopefully the rare card's actually decent and not just a throwaway Commander card, right? Then you have usual, like, cores or whatnot that exist within them, and it's just like, oh, if you draft within a couple particular colors, you'll probably be fine, right? But for the most part, there's kind of an equalizing aspect to it, where even people who are experienced with retail draft, there's a certain amount of variance that still exists. Like, sometimes you're just not going to end up with playable cards. Sometimes you're just not going to end up with, like, good bombs. Sometimes you're just going to open bad packs.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. And no matter how good of cards you get passed around, sometimes your deck just doesn't come together, even as an experienced player. And the opposite can be true for new players, where it's just like, they can be completely new to the game, but end up pulling, like, strong cards. And being like, well, this is the rare, this is the good card, so therefore I'm going to try to build around it.
Yeah, it's got the fancy symbol on it, right? Surely that's the best card in the pack, and you're probably going to be right, more often than not. So yeah, I think that's fair.
Right. And there's a distinct bomminess with retail formats that is distinct, that kind of acts as that equalizing force because it adds that variance. Now, Cube, as much as I enjoy the fact that we've, like, kind of cut a lot of that variance out of a majority of the cubes, and we've tried to, like, create those very intentional power outliers, or trying to bring it closer together in terms of power scaling, a lot of Cube is more consistent, right? A lot of it is, you're not going to end up with a bunch of garbage. It's usually going to be like a bunch of one-off cards, and that's going to be the most common type of Cube you run into, right? Where it's, I have one of every type of card, whatnot, and then a bunch of things that overlap, as opposed to in, once again, retail limited, where you're going to see the same commons, uncommons, and whatnot be passed around a few times, which gets you familiar with them, right?
Yep, agreed. And I will say that's one of the things that I do like very much about Retail Limited is not just that you've got that familiarity with things kind of floating around that are going to be identical, but there's also the warm, fuzzy blanket of, especially if you're picking up a box, right? And we did this not long ago during our event. We've done this at numerous times with our group. If you pick up a box of Dominaria or you pick up a box of Innistrad or whatever, there's going to be enough overlap within the archetypes, within the colors, where drafting a functional deck, even as a newer player, and you're just looking for something fairly simple, isn't particularly difficult, right? Typically, I would say, I would argue you could stick with the colors and you're going to be okay. Whereas cube designers will obviously look at that. And a lot of cube designers and cube designs kind of follow that, something similar, right? Here's the, my Blink package, which is these colors. And here's my Lands Matters or my Aristocrats, and they're these colors. But now we're stepping away from the familiarity of the colors, and now we're starting to think about accessibility and skill floor when it comes to the archetype themselves. And I will say that many moons ago, we used to play Commander with someone, and we did, I'm trying to think what kind of a draft it was. Anyway, but he drafted a card. It was the rare in the pack or the mythic, and he just couldn't get it to work. And the reason was, it was because it was a very aristocrats rewarding legendary creature. Again, this was not Commander. This was just retail draft. And we had to kind of look at him afterwards and sit him down. He was a newer player. And we said, look, we understand what you're trying to do, but you're misreading where the value of this card comes from. And that can be such a challenge, where you're looking at a card that is on your opponent's side and they're doing all this stuff, and all of a sudden you're losing life and potentially having to sacrifice creatures and all this stuff. And you're thinking, how on earth are they doing that? Maybe you saw that card, maybe you passed it, maybe you're just, every time you're looking at that card thinking, oh my God, how are they doing that? I don't understand. So now you're also extending that skill floor from what are the decisions that I've made to get the cards in my card pool, to how am I playing them, to now the reaction and the interaction that I'm kind of depending on to win, that my opponents are doing, right? How do I understand what they're doing if I don't understand what I'm doing?
And I guess it can kind of lead into what's difficult about drafting for people who aren't familiar with it as a concept, because it doesn't really matter if it's like Magic drafting or Slay the Spire, for an off example, right?
Sure.
The people who are going to be into drafting are going to be like really into drafting, and we're going to be like looking into ways that we're going to try to optimize our picks and trying to go down different lanes and picking up signals.
Yeah.
We start wanting to learn a lot more of these advanced ideas and techniques and etc. while little Timmy is across from us, like being like, I don't know, this guy has he has cool art, has good power toughness. So I guess this guy's good. Right? Completely ignoring the fact that it doesn't have evasion or anything, right? But even though that these are good learning tools for people to learn how to play Magic, it can also act as a sort of gatekeeping factor, because then it makes people feel punished for drafting. How do I put it? It can make them feel punished for drafting poorly, which isn't entirely wrong. But how do we help that?
Well, okay. So first of all, let's speak a hard truth, and that is that Magic is complicated, even at a fairly simple level, right? And you could argue like, hey, here's a cube, or it could be any format. Here is an environment where literally all you've got in your deck is lands and creatures, and all you need to do to win is turn creatures sideways, right? Let's talk about that as maybe the most basic, foundational level of Magic. Then you start throwing in some instants and some sorceries, maybe a combat trick. But again, these need to be very, very simple, straightforward cards. I think if you threw that in front of most people, they'd be able to pick it up very quickly. But it doesn't take long for Magic to start getting real complex, real fast. And for someone that is completely unfamiliar with the game, right? Never seen it before, no experience with any other TCG or anything like it. You can imagine that someone even just reading those cards, they're going to look at it. It's easy for us Magic players to say, well, just read the card. That's how you know what the card does. Just read the card. But I can imagine for a very new player or someone who's had no exposure, that even just sitting there and looking at that thinking, well, hang on, there's still some level of understanding that I need about the mechanics of Magic. And unless, I've taught people before when I've said, this is your mana value. Why is there a green there? Oh, that's because it's a green mana forest. Well, how do I get green mana? Well, you tap one of these forests, but that isn't a forest, and that taps for green mana. No, well, that's a guild gate, and that's, oh, okay. What about this power and toughness? Well, that's how much damage they can take, and how much, okay, so if it takes 2 damage, it dies. Like, yes, okay. But what if it takes 1 damage, and the next turn it takes 1 damage? No, damage. Like, all the stuff that I'm talking about is extremely fundamental that you and I, as an enfranchised Magic player, will kind of take for granted that we just have that understanding, right? It's ingrained in the mentality. So any cube, and I can't think of a cube that would be put in front of me that I would have struggles understanding what the cards do. But that is, and maybe that's my skill flaw, is I can understand what the cards do. My skill ceiling, it probably isn't a million miles above that, but where do you need to get to for every level of player that you're trying to engage, that you're trying to get to play, right? And how do you communicate? Because the skill flaw, ultimately, when it comes down to it, is if you're trying to get new players to play your cube, and that could be new players because they're new to Magic, it could be new players because they're new to cube, that skill flaw is on you. It's on you as the curator, it's on you as the designer, it's on you as the person that is asking people, have this experience instead of the one that you showed up in your 100 card pack with your legendary creature, right? So that skill flaw, right. And that has to be a very delicate and oftentimes complicated discussion, especially if you're now putting some level of, I have to also explain Magic's mechanics in order because I would say this, if I was a new player and I was at least familiar enough to know how creatures worked and instants and sorceries and maybe planeswalkers, but if I had someone show up and be like, hey, here's my cube, and I had to start having them explain all of the mechanics, I'm probably going to shut off from that fairly quickly, because I'm just thinking, well, I don't want to have to learn this entire game. I was able to pull out this commander deck or whatever, and I was able to play and understand what I was doing. Sure, I might not understand what everyone's doing. That's kind of the nature of the game. But at least I understand what I was going to do, and now I don't even have that. So that's a skill flaw that I think is, it's on that person that's bringing that experience and to understand, I suppose, the group that you're engaging.
Right. So there is a pattern that I've definitely noticed when it comes to the difference between even introducing new players to Commander compared to any other format. And there is a sort of communal deck building that goes with it, right? Especially with Commander, when we're trying to help each other understand how to build a deck, what you're looking for, what kind of play style you're going for. And don't get me wrong, Commander is complicated. There's so many cards to go through, and asking a new player to sit down and build a deck is a big ask, right? But when they're building that deck, they know that they can come and ask you with questions, right? They know that you can be there to kind of recommend things, of being like, hey, I think this thing's cool. I want to build a deck around it. And then you can be like, okay, so we're going to start with this thing, and then this thing, and then this thing. Mm-hmm. And then you can kind of explain why along the way.
Yep.
And the typical draft experience doesn't support that. They're on their own. And that can be another huge debilitating factor for people who aren't familiar with drafting in general. So there are cubes that can exist, like, for example, Anthony Stu had a giant cube, right? Where it feels more like a team effort, where you have somebody building with you and actually sitting there and working through the cards with you to kind of teach you the game. And that can help a lot. I feel like another aspect is if people had a team approach to drafting, where it was just this side of the table's one team, this side of the table's the other team type thing. And then you're just trying to score based off of everybody's teams, that way you can have people kind of interact with each other, talk about their decks, and then work through things. So I feel like that there are compromises that are potentially there. It's just very difficult to get them to that step when it's so already daunting.
Yeah.
Right?
Do you think players mostly are approaching this as this is an individual effort? You know, you expect it when you're playing Commander. You expect it when you're playing 60 card formats. This is the way that you're approaching the game, right? I'm approaching this as I'm going to play, you know, by myself. And I'm fully invested in the fact that I'm not going to get any help, or I'm not going to get much help. But with Cube, it's maybe difficult to understand that you might need that little tip, right? You might need that little bit of extra help. I will say that when I first started even playing Commander, I was very happy to ask questions. I felt that I was new to the format, and I wanted to use the time that I had early on to understand, to figure out more about the Magic in general, to understand the format, to understand, you know, how to evaluate different threats and how to sequence my turns even, and how to play. And I felt like asking those questions was incredibly valuable to me. I'll be very grateful to all the people that had their patience with me to help me out. I don't necessarily think I need that as much now, although it certainly does help when I'm playing Cube and I'm like, hey, do you have this card in your cube? And they're like, no. Oh, okay then. But again, this is something that is an experience over time, that also understanding the correct questions to ask, rather than just, I'm sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, I don't know what cards are good, what cards are bad. I don't know, you know, and maybe you've just unlocked the secret, and that secret is Two-Headed Giant. And that's how we teach people how to play Cube.
Because the alternative is having someone shadow you, and the problem that I have with people like just shadowing somebody, and it can be helpful, but to a certain degree, people like that feeling of agency, right? They like to feel like the decisions that they're making is theirs, and their choices end up mattering and whatnot. And then just having the other person kind of just sit on standby answering questions can be boring, right? So from both fronts, I feel like that just shadowing is not enough, as opposed to Two-Headed Giant, where you could kind of get around that to a degree, where you can work with your partner while they're building their deck that can help you build yours and whatnot, so that way you can feel like that you're not just flailing in the draft and hoping for the best, right? So
I would
be
agree.
like, hey, I'm in between a couple of these choices, and then they'll be like, oh, well, I'm surprised that you're not thinking about this one.
Even if it's not during the actual draft itself, even if it's just part of the deck building portion, which is, I feel like, if you've got a new player, you can always tell them like, hey, take the first card that you pick, right? Look through it. Look for a big flashy creature or a planeswalker or a spell that looks like it's particularly interesting. Take the colors and then try and focus on drafting those colors, and then draft whatever fixing comes your way, right? I feel like if you could tell someone just follow that mentality, they're probably at the very least going to be able to put together a functional deck out of the cards that they have, right? And sometimes, especially in the Two-Headed Giant, that's really all you need. Yeah,
I agree. Moving on to my next kind of question, kind of statement-ish. It's somewhere in the realm.
Somewhere in the middle.
I'm wanting a response.
Okay.
Is my point.
I'll see what I can do.
At what point do you feel like a game, like your format, your cube, whatnot, not being Magic anymore is a detriment?
I think that is very playgroup specific, because I think that there are people out there like myself. You showed up with your bag of change and your box of Magic cards and said, hey, this is an experience. I'd like to see how you guys feel about it. And we were like, yeah, absolutely. Let's try that. I am very open to trying new things. I'm very open to exploring how Magic can be experienced in different ways outside of just you play your lands and cast your spells even, which is, again, part of the fundamentals of Magic. So for me, and I would say that I can make that statement. I can't say the same thing for the rest of the people, even in my group. I think there's certainly people within the group that I play that if you started asking them to play a format of Magic that involved something other than playing their lands and casting their spells, they would probably be like, yeah, this is a little bit too goofy for me. It's not really what I'm looking for. So I think that it's such an individual discussion that, I mean, then the reason why I say group is because typically with a cube, you need a group of people, right? You want multiple, you want at least, 2 occasionally, but at least 4 a lot of the time, and hopefully 6 or 8. So I think you need to have an understanding of the group, honestly, in order to really make a decision on just how receptive the players are going to be.
So, following up from that, what do you think are the best questions to find out how receptive they are? Not for my particular case, but in case listeners are having similar issue, right?
I think if it's, let's call it a traditional cube, right? And
Right.
I'll say traditional as in it's a 360 card cube, and let's say you've got 8 players, and you say, right, I have a cube. These are the themes, right? So I could say, here's my cube. It's Diablo themed. A lot of my friends are familiar with the Diablo game franchise, video games. So I could say, here is my Diablo themed cube. It is focused around the themes of the video game, everything from the classes, the character classes, to the monsters and the mechanics within the game, just within a card game, right? So that would be fairly easy for me to explain to them. Similarly, with your Fey Cube or Anthony's Horror Cube or whatever. So I think that would be, fairly straightforward for me to explain and for me to sell that to them. But I think, again, once you're starting to go outside of that and start bringing in either alternative game pieces or very separate mechanics, I think that's where, again, I think it gets complicated.
So, related to that, I think that it is particularly interesting how a lot of the conversations that I have with people that aren't involved in cube spaces is usually centered around their interactions or hearing about or watching streamers playing the vintage cube,
Sure.
right? And even people who are interested in the concept of cube and whatnot, they're kind of starting off at this, so if we're going to play cube, we're going to play like vintage cube and whatnot. However, I don't think that even as much as that is like hard magic, like that is just magic, right? But it's also a certain degree of you're getting into like some complex cards. You're getting into some like complex pack one pick ones, for lack of a better example, right?
Yeah,
where
I would agree.
the choices of power feels like that it's a lot more significant in your draft, and there's a lot more larger of a margin of error when you have here's a couple power 9 pieces and then like some other garbage, and then somebody who's new is not going to understand the difference, right?
Yes, I think that most players are going to have an understanding that a Black Lotus and a Moxen, unless you're very, very, very new to the game and you've not had any exposure. And I think this is, much to the chagrin of a lot of people within the Cube community, that is one of the things that is just organic when it comes to the vintage Cube, because it is the most accessible, because it's playable on Modo. It is the one where there exists the most amount of content, right? Be it YouTube or Twitch. It's pretty hard not to go and find someone doing something vintage cube oriented, right? So I would agree. I actually think that there's a lot more parity within the vintage. Like, power creep has existed to such a level now where you could imagine a time where power 9 is extremely powerful, right? And then there was this huge drop off, right? But there was a kind of a curve of you would go from the power 9, and then you would have some other fairly strong cards and all the way down. Now I think that power level is starting to become much more flat, even relative to the power 9, right? Because you've got these very, very explosive creatures, spells that are capable of winning the game by themselves, and there's a lot of those cards, right? It's not just, I remember when kind of things like Upheaval, right? Upheaval is essentially a card that you need to build around, but if you do and you make it work, you win the game, pretty much, right? But there's more cards nowadays that can have an impact that's very close to like that kind of Upheaval level of impact in a game. So I think that the vintage cube, and this is I will say I do enjoy playing vintage cube, but it's something that I don't wish to do very often. I would much rather be playing like the horror cube or your fake cube or something that's more thematic, that's got some different sort of more interesting build lines and play patterns, rather than just, hey, we're casting reanimate, or we're going for brain freeze or something like that. So yeah, I think that we could have a whole discussion just about the vintage cube. It pertains to everything from the skill floor to the skill ceiling. We're not going to do that today, though.
That's not the conversation for now. But expanding a bit on like our conversation of the vintage cube, just a smidge, is that I definitely agree with you that a lot of the advantages that makes the vintage cube accessible despite some of the complexity that can exist within the cards, and despite how much cards can be that power differential, and more importantly, as much as like this kind of become flatlined, right? How does a player know when to take like Oko over like Goblin Bombardiers, right?
We are talking about the vintage cube, aren't we? So Bombardiers is a powerful card that here's the thing. Neither of those cards really...
Keep in mind, this is like mostly rhetorical, right?
Yeah. A lot of those cards in that sort of power band, right? And we've talked about power bands. I would put a lot of them that are fairly adjacent nowadays in that, certainly if you're talking about, Bombardiers and Oko and even Uro that are somewhat adjacent power level. I honestly don't think there's a right or wrong answer, because I don't think there's a wrong time to take any of those cards. I think Bombardiers is a strong enough card that if you're in the colors and you're able to cast it, you're going to be able to get good value out of it. And I think that's one of the things that is sort of an identity as far as the vintage cube is concerned, is that there's a lot of those cards that are just, they're powerful in a vacuum. They don't require this build around. Whereas again, with a lot of the more thematic cubes, you are more likely, at least in my experience, and I'd love to hear feedback from other people, including yourself on this, that the build around cards and the engine cards and the payoff cards, you kind of need to pay a lot of attention to how you're drafting in order to make sure that those cards are going to be able to do work for you, right? It's not like in the vintage cube where you can say, well, if I'm going to draft Bombardiers, and if I get it and I get some ways to sling crap at people, I'm probably going to have a pretty good shot at doing some serious damage in this game, right? Same with Oko. If I just cast Oko, I can just start ticking it up and make food tokens that I can turn into 3/3s and maybe even steal something of yours. So these cards are great in a vacuum. It's one of the reasons why I think the vintage cube can be surprisingly friendly to new players, because you don't have that, intensity with some of the archetypes. All right, if you're trying to draft some of the combos, like you're trying to draft Brain Freeze, like that might not be obvious to a new player, but some of those cards, or a lot of those cards, are so powerful in a vacuum that can exist within that cube that it's fairly easy to just make them work by themselves.
Right. So, following from that, I would say that one of the big advantages that the vintage cube has to that degree, and when you have a lot of cards that exist within these sort of vacuums, right?
Sure.
Is that when people interacting with content creators that are talking about like vintage cube and whatnot, it's a lot easier to kind of follow what their picks are and follow like what their reasoning is, and like actually get feedback for those cards and see the decks that are working, and because there's just so much traffic. There's so much content around it that it creates this access point that actually makes it really, really easy for people to get engaged with vintage cube.
Yes.
Which is a great thing. However, it can also act as a difficulty for, again, those thematic cubes, the cubes that have a lot more of those synergy-based interactions and whatnot. So I have a specific example in mind as a kind of transition point, right?
Sure.
Where the Fey Cube has a card called the Strands of Night. Strands of Night is 2 black for an enchantment. You can play back, pay 2 life, sacrifice a swamp, return target creature from your graveyard to play.
I like it already.
So, yeah, this is a card that I love. It is a card that is a lot of fun to build around. It's a lot of fun to interact with within my cube. There's a lot of ways that you can kind of mill yourself and throw things in the yard and take advantage of like lands going to the yard or whatever, right?
Sure.
But for the most part, Strands of Night is supposed to be this repeatable, like, value engine type thing that can just out-pressure your opponents.
Okay.
However, when people are engaging with the Fey Cube, I get questioned a lot about this card, where it's just like, but why would we have this over something like a Dread Return, right? Why have this over some other 4-cost reanimate spell, right? And the long and short of it is that they're not quite thinking like a cube creator, and I can't expect that of them, right? And that's kind of the interaction that we get from a lot more of these unique styled of cubes, right? And a lot more of these synergy-based cubes and whatnot. Like the amount of times that I get questioned of whether or not the Strands of Night deck is real, right? It doesn't matter if it's real. It is that the potential's there. It's fun to play with. It's fun for me to play with, right? It's a fun thing that I always am trying to aim for, right?
Yeah, and
it doesn't matter if it's real.
No, and
having to explain that to somebody is
yes,
a lot for them to process.
It can be. It can be. So I know that you've been designing cubes and playing Magic for a long time. So if I see a card like this, I'm thinking you've put it in for a couple of reasons. Number one, because there is a strong archetype that is build-aroundable with this card. I'm thinking there's support for... It could be one of two.
We have like the Lord of the Rings land cyclers in here and whatnot. We have a bunch of cycling cards in here. We have a bunch of mill cards in here. We have so many things that we could just dump into the graveyard with discard, with mill, with cycling. It doesn't matter because you have so many ways to fill the yard. This is just a way to turn your graveyard into a toolbox.
Oh, 100%, right? But I can also imagine, especially, again, going back to the skill floor and especially for newer players, seeing the fact that not only do I have to pay double black, which maybe a newer player might not focus as much on, but me as a little more established and, you know, I don't want to say better player, more experienced.
You're paying 6 mana, sacrificing a swamp and 2 life in order to reanimate one thing.
Hang on, I have to sacrifice one of my lands. Why would I want to do that? I need my lands. I want to be able to cast my spells. Why are you making me sack lands? Like that's not very friendly. That's not fun. I can certainly see in the past where I have had those discussions with myself, like while I've been drafting or looking at cards, like, man, that sucks. I don't want to have to sacrifice lands. But for a more established and more enfranchised player that understands the value of even just being able to bring 1 or maybe even 2 creatures back from the graveyard to your hand with the ease at which you can do that, like, again, like you said, fill your graveyard, self-mill, whatever, cycling. That's an incredibly attractive way to be able to cheat things into play. It's a kind of high ceiling but also a high floor kind of deck, if you will, right? It takes a bit of work to get there, but if you get there, it can work wonders. So this is a card that I think I love it. I would love to see it, but it could be extremely daunting for some players as well.
Oh, absolutely. The reason that I call it out isn't because I'm trying to say that my players are wrong for it, right? The reason that I'm saying it is that there's a sort of goggles that we have that we've talked about a few times already, where we have experience, and especially me in particular, of being a cube builder and whatnot, that I'm constantly looking at like the top down of the environment. I'm looking at like what the signals are, what the curator is trying to tell me with each pack of cards, right? There's a sort of meta understanding that I have of what the curator's vision is.
Yes.
As opposed to people who are pro players that are much better players at Magic than I am, who are just like, ignore what the curator says, just pick good cards, whatnot. And then people who are new, who don't know quite fully understand how to pick the good cards, and more importantly, see cards like this, and instead of getting that eureka, aha, Johnny brain moment, right? Instead, they're just kind of left with question marks, where it's just like, why would I ever want to use this, especially when you have like Ever After in here, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you have Thwart the Grave in here.
Yeah.
Or even Cauldron Dance. Insert list here.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And I suppose the counterpoint that I will make is that this card being in there and this card being a complicated card still doesn't mean that your newer players or your less enfranchised players have to play complicated decks, right? You can still just pick that vanilla green creature or that very straightforward Boros, burn them and sling creatures at them deck, right? There's a reason why those exist. And it's not just for newer players. There's enfranchised players that enjoy playing those more low to the ground, more straightforward, aggressive strategies as well. And this is where, we could always bring this full circle and say it's about the quality of the cube in general. If you have support for fairly straightforward strategies, which are kind of necessary unless the cube design philosophy is meant to be extremely complicated, then, even if we look at the vintage cube, which isn't, to be honest, it isn't an overly complicated cube, and even some of the most broken combos in the history of Magic, a lot of them have been very, very straightforward. But everything is still, in my opinion, relatively new player accessible and if they've got a perfunctory understanding of how Magic functions and how the game works, and you can explain to them, this is how you go infinite with Kiki Jiki, or this is how you take Strands of Night, play it for 4 mana, and then yes, you might have to sacrifice a couple of swamps and pay a couple of life, but you can cheat out 2 or 3 massive creatures that are going to end the game very quickly.
Yep. And keep in mind, at instant speed, which means you can hold up interaction.
Oh, yeah. When can I do that?
The big difference.
Can I do it anytime? Well, this is where you read the card. Does it say you can only do this on your turn or at sorcery speed or whatever? No, it doesn't. Well, knock yourself out. Have fun.
Yep. And that's where a lot of that experience acts as that differing factor between people who are experienced and people who aren't at draft, right? Where people who are experienced, especially when they're more on the Johnny Brain side, where there's a sort of exciting element to these cards of, we're not only assessing cards, we're also looking at what's the dumb thing I can do with this? What is the dumb deck I can try to build with this? Not because necessarily I'm looking for, like, the best playing thing as much as I'm looking to do what's the most interesting thing that I'm going to have fun playing, right? Versus spiky players can kind of look for, okay, what are the best cards in this pack? What are the best cards in this pack? And then just kind of working down and seeing, oh, well, how many colors can I get? How many things can I get? Whatnot. And then once again, back to Timmy, where it's just like, yes, this is a creature with evasion, and I'm just going to keep turning things sideways and hope for the best.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. And actually, Anthony and I, while you were at your convention, or virtual convention, it was a conversation that Anthony and I had. We recorded one. So this episode, whenever this is released, I don't know when the episode that I'm going to be referring to, maybe it was released 2 or 3 weeks previous. But we went into some detail about how we draft and about the decisions that we make and the thought processes, right? So it was everything. And that sort of... Why are you drafting? What is the purpose of this draft, right? Are you trying to break the cube? Are you trying to have fun? Have you noticed a card that maybe you've never seen before or that you've always wanted to make work? So you take that card and you think, okay, I'm going to look for every supporting piece and I'm just going to see how much fun I can have with this particular archetype. I tend to draft like that. I generally tend to force something early on when I see something particularly interesting. Sometimes I might just see an archetype that's open that I know is very powerful and think, okay, I'm just going to try and win some games today and not overthink it too much. But there is always that I'm always looking to try and have fun first and do something interesting first before I'm necessarily focusing on power, right? I'm looking for synergy. I'm looking for, something cool to do. We'll try and kind of sum it up, right? This really started with skill flaw. It's not a skill flaw of a particular element of the whole cube experience, right? It starts with the curator. It starts with the choices of the cards that go into the cube. It starts with or it continues with the archetypes that exist, with the support that exists, all the way through, the fixing, the meat versus the vegetables. And then it extends through to the players themselves, right? How are you expecting them to evaluate their cards? How appropriate is the demand of the skill level in comparison to the skill level of the group? And it even doesn't have to be the whole group. It could be within the group itself. If you've got 8 players and you know that you've got a couple of newer players and then you've got a couple of very, very powerful players, you've still got to try and tailor that experience so everyone is having a good time. Sometimes that could just be that, hey, you newer players, we're going to help you out. We're going to give you some, we're going to give you a cheat sheet, or we're going to give you some advice on how to build a strong deck. And maybe the very, very experienced players, we're going to try and encourage you to do something a little off the cuff, right? A little experimental. Go and try and have a bit more fun this time instead of necessarily trying to spike every draft. That's also part of that skill flaw. It's also, it's not just the cube construction. It's how you're trying to get the play experience for everyone, from if you have new players to all the way up if you just have 8 spikes, or however everyone is just tryharding, sweating to try and win every game. That all is part of that skill flaw that can essentially go all the way up pretty dang close to the skill ceiling.
I definitely agree with you on that.
All right. Well, this was a fun one. This was May's little honeypot of insight, and she always is bringing the value and bringing the reality. I will say that you always seem to bring up a topic that sparks so much thought, and this was a fun one. So thank you. We'll miss Anthony. Congratulations to him and his son who graduated high school. They're off celebrating, so we'll have Anthony back very soon. And I'm going to go over to the socials. As always, a big thanks to all of our patrons, to Patrick, Jeff, Nick, Chris, Timber Dragon, Brian Keaton, Lord Justice, Nick LaPointe, Preston, and Sam McKenna. Huge thanks to all of you guys, as always, for the ongoing support. As far as just talking about Cube, get in on it. Facebook.com/groups/MTGCube. Get in on the discussion there with a lot of, I think they've got over 1,200 members over there right now. So a lot of cool conversation going on. If you want to hit us up, you can find us at Twitter at UberCubeMTGPod or via email. If you've got a longer question or comment, UberCubeMTGPodcast@gmail.com. As always, come hang out with us on the UberCube Discord. You can also find us on Bluesky, UberCubeMTGPodcast.bsky.social. And if you're looking for content on YouTube, you can also find it at Ubercube MTG Podcast 747. Again, huge thanks to all of our patrons, and we're going to say what we always say:
Happy cubing!